So first of all, I'd like to welcome everyone for joining us today for our virtual artist talk with Alanna Reeves. My name is Gabrielle Tillenberg, and I'm the exhibitions coordinator at Strathmore. Typically, I do lead our tours in person at Strathmore, but obviously, since we're unable to be together in person, we are supporting this series, which involves talking with artists who we've worked with before or will be working with in the future. And today we're joined by artist Alanna Reeves, who's going to be exhibiting with us in a show that is coming up in January 2021 that I curated called Past Process. So Alanna, if you could just say hello. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Alanna. Again, thank you, Gabby, and to everyone at Strathmore for inviting me to participate in the exhibition. I'm really looking.
Oh, Alanna, I think we lost you just for a second.
Sorry to talk.
Alanna, let's see if you could maybe get to your, you said you had a backup Wi-Fi connection.
Yeah.
Let me go ahead and message her. And while she's doing that, we're getting Alanna back online. I just wanted to mention to everyone that while we are having this conversation, we want to involve everyone as much as possible. So please feel free to send me your questions in the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question during this conversation. We'd love to hear from you as we look at her artwork. Alanna, it looks like we've got you back. So,
Okay.
all right. So I'm glad you had that backup hotspot available.
Yes,
so,
sorry, everyone.
That's all right. So could you tell us a little bit about who you are as an artist? What does your practice involve? And what you explore as an artist?
Sure. So for anyone who doesn't know, I'm from DC. I'm a DC-based artist. I work primarily in printmaking. I do some painting, and I like incorporating a lot of fiber works into my art so I can play with different textures. My work is primarily focused on identity. I use my own background and identity to kind of inform me on discussions with other people who may or may not be from a similar background or from completely different backgrounds, to just inform conversation on how we can look at race, identity, nationality, and how we can talk about it. I like looking back into our childhoods and our families and how we were raised, and kind of what discussions we had or what activities in particular. I look a lot at childhood activities, how all of those things informed us and how they may have misinformed us and how we can correct them now.
Great. And I think it would be prudent then to just jump into looking at some of the artwork that you've provided for us today to explore. So let's go ahead and start with this piece here. Can you talk about, like you mentioned, identity is very important in your work, exploring those childhood activities, and this piece does speak to that. Could you let us know, first of all, how you made this, and then how it speaks to those themes you're exploring?
Yes. So this piece is, I believe it's around 16 by 20. It is a photo transfer onto muslin, which is a really cheap or affordable fabric. And then the line work that you see across the photograph, those squares and crosses, that is embroidery floss. So muslin, the fabric that this is printed on, is thin enough that it can easily allow for manipulation with fibers and stitching, things like that. And so I made this piece, which is a portrait of my grandfather on my father's side, as a way for me to reflect on my own identity. This was a man who I knew throughout my childhood, but he passed away early on in my life, and we never really were able to form our own relationship together. But he does have a presence in my life still. My father still shares stories of his father. And I know that his impact on my father impacted me. So that is why I created this piece. And, you know, it's a really striking photograph of him, and it kind of allows for a really easy way to connect with him in that sense. And this piece overall kind of really encapsulates many themes of my work, or kind of materials that I use, like archival family photos, the tradition of handwork, and also with the embroidery, I'm referencing again those childhood activities. For me, a childhood activity was cross stitch. So kind of working with fibers and patterns in order to make an image. And in this piece, I'm kind of looking at how patterns and guides and other childhood activities, they're given to children. They're told how to create an image. They're meant to, you know, finalize someone else's idea that is more commonly shared with the world versus, you know, going in and making your own like abstract painting. Although of course there is a little bit of that, but I feel like most of my childhood activities were playing with dolls that were given, you know, specific outfits, you know, using coloring books, and again, using cross stitch. But in this, I'm not using a cross stitch pattern. So I'm thinking about the idea of, again, my grandfather had a set of ideas and morals that he passed down to my father, which my father passed down to me. So I'm thinking of this cross stitch as a guide that I'm being given, but I'm now breaking away from, because I have the knowledge of it, and I now have the will and the mind to use it on my own and present it as my own thing.
Yeah, and it's interesting because as you talk about like relating this to a childhood activity, and then also engaging this photograph that has some kind of presence in your family and in space. You know, I think a lot about I relate it to the experience of being a child, and I think of some other people who have had the same, where you have these sort of treasured analog photographic prints of family members that are limited. They're not, you know, they're not digitized yet. And then sort of what happens when a kid can get their hands on it, and it's kind of breaking outside of that mold of you know, what's acceptable in terms of that, the engagement with the photograph,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of like the danger of making your own marks of the photograph. But how I remember as a child being really sort of called to engage with the images in that way, and sort of the mishaps that happen because of that.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, you know, it's interesting to relate that way to it, you know, in your sense of exploring that, what was controlled as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a chat message to Prudence. You said you had an observation. We'd love to hear it. If you want to unmute yourself or add it in the chat, feel free.
Yes. Okay. I'll unmute myself. Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Well, I'm glad to be here and meeting Alanna. Okay. When I looked at this work, the cross stitching at first looked to me like a fence that you can see through, but that is a barrier between the figure and the viewer, meaning barrier between you. So when you said that you knew this grandfather, but not really that well because he transitioned or passed before you maybe achieved adulthood and could really have a meaningful relationship with him, I was wondering if the cross-stitching superimposed on the face is kind of like you can see them, but there were barriers.
Mm-hmm.
There's like a fence in age or the passing of time or death between you and him. I was just wondering about that.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful observation. So thank you for sharing it. It did feel that way. And I think there's kind of a duality to it. Like you said, there's very much a barrier because I, again, was not able to develop my own relationship with this person. But at the same time, you know, I'm leaving some spaces open. Like I didn't want to cross the eye. I didn't want to cover the eyes. I wanted to leave those open. And some of the cross stitch, some of it is blocking, but some of it is kind of following these features, but still in a kind of contained way. Like there are a few stitches, if you look closely around the eyes, where they're a more organic form. But then there are, like just on his left cheek, our right, you know, the cross stitch kind of follows the cheekbone. That's where it's kind of contained again. And that's kind of where I'm following a natural curve of this person and their reality, but it's still, it's not quite natural. It is still kind of blocked off and guarded, and it's still studied. It's not a natural relationship. It's a studied relationship, and it's an imagined one, really. It's the relationship I imagined I might have with this person at this point in my life.
And I think, there's so much about distance and connection in those images too. And we have some of that in your other works, relating to people, but also I think so strongly place becomes of significance in your work. So would you mind sort of transitioning into thinking about or talking about this piece and the connections you're making in your process?
Yes. So this piece is a larger work. I will admit that this is a painting kind of done on loose muslin. It hasn't been wrapped yet, so the dimensions are a little bit variable at this time. But it is on the larger side. I think width-wise, it's at least 5 feet. But again, this is also done on muslin, so it's that, you know, more economical fabric. It's a little bit thinner. And on here I've used a type of fabric paint. So it's similar to an acrylic. And because I'm painting onto a raw fabric, that's what's allowing for these really kind of watercolor-like textures. And I actually just use a spray bottle to saturate and, you know, make the fabric wet before I start painting into it. And of course, there are different levels of ink that I'm using in here. There are, you know, some portions of it where it's really opaque. But this piece, I am thinking of an idea that I've been carrying around with me for a long time now, which is that of the idealized homeland. So for me, as a hyphen American, someone that would be not considered solely from the US, and again, my background is Caribbean American. Particularly, I focus on Jamaica because that is what my father is closely tied to. But again, there's this idea as a hyphen American of the homeland. And I think that that's something, if you're like me, it's like my father is a first generation American citizen, or if you're an immigrant, or I think anyone that is told that they are othered in the US kind of has this idea of the homeland, this idea of where they're from and would maybe be more accepted and comfortable and able to feel more connected with themselves. And that's something I've been carrying around a lot with me. In particular, after reading a book by the author's called, or her name is Emily Rabateau. Her book is called Searching for Zion. And I thought it was a really great example of these ideas that I'm thinking of, where she traveled to several places in the world, including Ethiopia, Ghana, Jamaica, all of these places where people outside of those countries kind of say that that is where they can kind of be in peace with themselves or their religion. But then they get there and it's not as they imagined. They're not fully accepted there, or it's not such a prosperous land as they thought it might be. So for me, I'm thinking of Jamaica. And for me, when I'm depicting Jamaica and my connection to Jamaica and kind of establishing my identity as Jamaican, I see that I tend to draw the landscape. And I think it's important to recognize that, like, in that there's a little bit of fetishization that's going along with it, even though I can, say that I'm from there. Even though I visited there many times with my Jamaican family, I'm still seeing Jamaica from the viewpoint of an American, where it's this, lush tropical space that's meant for, you to go there and relax, versus, thinking of it as a real land of people who are, in reality, if you were to go there, if you were to stay in a hotel, I think people would readily tell you the reality is Jamaica has not really found a place for itself where it can keep its citizens. I think there's a large focus on hospitality and nursing, but otherwise, I think there's a lot of struggle there. And because of the tourism, a lot of people are losing access to land that they should have rights to. It's a lot of beachfront properties that are getting taken up. But so that's a whole, it really could be its whole other discussion for many places in the world. But for me, this piece is doing two things. It's working to tie myself to a country that I might refer to as a homeland. But it's also admitting that the connection there is a bit loose. So you'll see that there are hands kind of taking their time to explore in that landscape, while there are other hands that are shielding itself from it. It's not comfortable being there. And it's a little ominous looking. It's in black and white. And again, it's these body parts that are not really connected to anything else, but the story is a little bit funny, or a little bit more simple than that. It was actually from the last time I was able to visit Jamaica. I was in a more rural part, and I remember looking up into the trees and seeing all these banana spiders, which are these very large, very scary looking spiders. And there was someone there saying, don't keep looking up anymore. You're going to see, 50 more for every one that you see. And that did occur. So again, it was this moment where I was taking time to explore the space, but I felt actually very uncomfortable in it. Yeah.
And, as we get to the next piece, and in talking about how you are, sort of through more present experiences rather than these associations you've created, getting to know the other parts of, the other sides of Jamaica and sort of the way that the land is used. I'm interested in something that you've told me too about one of the pieces here, but to give it context, obviously I'd like to hear from you more about this piece that reflects on paper dolls and that childhood activity. But I would love if you would share with everyone, particularly as you begin to explore the different elements of this piece, the shirt here. And I just recall the story that you told me about that. I think it would be a great connection to what you just spoke to.
Yes. So I think a few people on here might actually be familiar with this piece, but for those that aren't, this is a series I made a couple years back now, called Little Jamaican American Girl. And it is referencing the smaller, they're 3x4 sticker paper doll activity books. So they are these books that are meant to be educational for smaller children. And they're meant to educate them on different nationalities, different cultures, and different experiences that people might have. But in this piece here, I'm reflecting on that activity and taking a look at it for how it really doesn't provide any sort of education, because really these books are not provided, the objects in them are not provided any text. So you're seeing aesthetically what might be important to one culture or nationality, but not actually learning what those things might be. So in this piece, I made two dolls, one that's a little bit more open and ready to greet and interact with you. The other is turned away and is a bit uncomfortable with the situation. And then there's this panel of objects, which are acting both to introduce people to popular Jamaican items. And then on the other side is talking about some of the stereotypes. So yes, this blue object in the bottom right-hand corner was actually, it's a little bit hard to see the detail there, but it shows one of the um, Margaritaville parrots. It's wearing a Rasta hat. It has dreads. And again, when I recently went to Jamaica, I did stay at a hotel. It did have excursions that would allow people to explore Jamaica. But in these planned excursions, you weren't stopping at any kind of local restaurants or anything like that. You were stopping at different Margaritaville restaurants with the menu that was just focusing on cheeseburgers, which I don't know. When I travel, I want to have food that's from that place. I don't really want to have a cheeseburger. So that was just kind of, again, talking about going back to specifically in Jamaica, there's all these properties being bought up, like beachfront properties. So citizens there are losing access to that land and that as a kind of a recreational space, which I find pretty unfortunate. And then again, kind of looking at tourism and hospitality, another object on there is a shirt that I meant to model off of a shirt for someone that would be working at one of these hotels, and the tag on it says paradise. So again, it's Jamaica's thought to be this paradise, but you do have, if you're going to stay in a hotel there, my experience has been that they're very forward with the fact that they might not make enough money there. They are very open about asking for tips. They're very open about talking about livelihood and opportunities there, and also very proud of their education system, which I think is important to note.
Yeah, it's interesting. Being someone who is relatively the same age as you, and thinking about how our childhood has shaped us at the time of, this 1990s effort to focus on multiculturalism. This piece actually reminded me I'm sure people might remember on here of Richard Scarry's Little World, which was an animation show, and they kind of had these characters like a pig who was German, and he had the lederhosen, and I think in the aim to bring awareness, those stereotypes were very much informed in a concrete, or it very much informed in a way that that was the first learning experience that people of our age have had, and to think about how that influences now the way that you see your own identity, how you see others, how you view even another place without, like you said, this firsthand knowledge of what's actually going on politically and socially there, is just really important to look at and sort of combat some of those learned myths, if we want to call it that. And so that brings me to also this another application of embroidery in your work, which connects also again to Jamaica. So would you mind going into briefly, because I want to make sure we get to your prints, the two pieces here that we have that are mixing photos, which we saw in the first piece, and embroidery.
Yes, so these two works here, and I will discuss them quickly. I wanted to include them because they're studies for something that informs the work that we'll look at next, the prints. But yes, these two works were really, for me, quick exercises in association. And again, playing with that idea of a guide being made, but breaking away from it or using it in a completely different way. So these were found images. And I chose them because they were actually acquired from one of those like secondhand shops that has, like a bin of photos. And I chose them because when I looked at them, I immediately was able to imagine something else on them. So like this field of trees here, I immediately thought of palm trees. I thought of like, what would I impose on these images? And I thought of, again, that like tropical background and environment that I end up relying on, because the aesthetics of my quote unquote homeland are my quickest connection to them right now. So similar with the second image where it's a horse that I've imagined to be a goat. If you go to Jamaica and you're going through the countryside, you're going to see 20 goats hanging out together, sitting out on the front porch of people's homes, versus here where if you drive through the countryside, you probably will also see some goats, but you're more likely to see a lot of like horses and cows together. So it was just a quick exercise in association, thinking about where you are currently, but where you might imagine yourself to be or where you would like to be.
Great, thank you. And I think for the next pieces, this is what you're was currently working on, your prints. And so I invite people to really take a look at these, because we're hoping, or we will be including your prints in the upcoming exhibition in January. You know, I think that for me, just the most immediate connection I make from the studies is the image of this palm tree. You know, where are those studies bringing you now to your work in these prints?
Well, so I think it is also important to preface for the prints that these were made while in residency at Pyramid Atlantic, which is a local printmaking art center and exhibition space and studio space. And really, I'm reintroducing myself to printmaking. Specifically, all the prints that we're going to look at are monoprints. So in reintroducing myself, I'm kind of taking a step back in my normal or standard practice as it is now. And I'm trying to think of how I can use these materials to convey the ideas that I've been working with. So creating those environments, which I will say is a little bit easier now. This piece, I used a stencil to kind of create these environments, and I used a lot of, if anyone's not familiar with printmaking, you start with, or there are a few things you can start with. I've been using just a 16 by 20 plate of plastic. You paint on that with oil-based inks. You lay a piece of paper on that, run that through a press so that the pressure of the printing press will transfer the image from that plastic plate to the piece of paper. And you do that so you can get beautiful textures like these that are kind of grainy. And again, using the Gamsol to kind of thin out some of that ink kind of gets these swirling patterns. And these stencils I'm using are what are creating the harder, more defined lines of the environment in here. But yes, so I am kind of taking a step back, working with these environments now. And I'm also working to see how I can incorporate, I'm most interested in incorporating grids, so kind of cross-stitch patterns. I want to see if I want to solely rely on a grid, or do I want to start working in fibers with these materials? Do I want to transform this into screen prints so I can, as the name Monoprint suggests, you're just getting kind of one unique print, versus screen printing where you can make many of the same thing. So I'm trying to figure out, do I want many of the same thing? Do I want many of the same grid so that I can give those out to people and kind of have them interact with it. And again, open up that conversation of identity and how we're discussing identity. How did we come to understand our identity? How are we explaining ourselves to other people? How are we understanding other people? So that is an intention of my work, is to open it up, not just through dialogue, but kind of invite other people to participate. But yes, so like here's an example of a grid. I'm starting off with a stencil, and yes, so a lot of these are in the moment, they're play. I think that's also important to note.
Yeah, yeah. And those textures that you speak to, the graininess, but then a lot of the swirling imagery, the quality of the ink, the opacity, it all comes back to some words that I think of with your work of just like hazy, in particular, thinking about the painting in the beginning on Muslim. So in terms of that quality, this sort of washy quality, how is that relating to, like, what makes you seek that in your work?
I think if I can be very upfront with myself, I just find that it's a really beautiful texture, and I find it incredibly captivating. And again, one of the things with printmaking is that, or monoprint specifically, is they're all going to be unique, and you don't really have control of all of the textures that are going to come out of it. So it's always a surprise. So that means there's a lot of prints that I actually don't love, but I'm going to hang on to, see if I can work on. But also the reason why I keep pursuing it is it feels really accurate for being in a stage of not having a complete understanding of something. I think it's, I think it's okay and great for me to take a look at myself and say, like, hey, I've been fetishizing something that I'm claiming to be a part of and claiming to be really proud of. I need to change my relationship with that. I think it's okay to, say I am proud of this identity, but to also recognize that my relationship with it is not that sturdy. And a lot of it is just kind of these dreams. I think it's okay for people that are othered to dream of a space where they might be comfortable. So I use these textures because they talk about, or I think they properly reflect kind of imagination and memory that is shaky. I love talking about how, every memory you have, it's like the first time you remember it, maybe that's a memory, but every time after that, you're just having a memory of the memory itself, and it keeps becoming diluted. That's another reason why I love working on muslin. It's not going to be a fabric that's going to hold up for my lifetime. It's very fragile. It's something that frays at the edges. It morphs and changes dimensions really easily. It's not a certain thing either. And I think that's a great way to talk about how education needs to keep going, discussions need to keep going. All these things are going to continue to change.
Yeah, I think that it comes across very well. So before, I'd like to make a comment, but I also want to make sure that people have a chance to ask any questions. If they were looking to do so, feel free to just send that to me in the chat, or you can speak up. But, if I may, I really appreciate that connection and those textures and how they speak to what you've just mentioned, because I think, in our society, particularly now, there's such a direction towards wanting to very clearly define things, particularly because so much has been lost and is not recognized and talked about. But the way that your work captures nuance and captures fluctuation, and really the ability to be many different things, or experience this in between space is really captivating and lovely. So Prudence, it looks like you've got an observation. We'd love to hear from you.
Okay, thank you. Can you flip back a few artworks back to the one with, it was Jamaica.
This one?
That one. Okay. You have, I don't know if this was intentional or if it just evolved as you were doing the art, but it seems clear that you have a foreground and a midground and a background. And when you were talking about Jamaica, the face of Jamaica seems to be the tourist industry, very outward looking for the country. And you were saying that you thought the country was not quite as strong in its own national identity, maybe, as opposed to the tourist industry. But anyway, looking at this artwork, you have the foreground, these arms of the people, you have the trees, the leaves, the spiders. Okay, you've got the environment, but as you look in that third grid, like you see the arrow, wait a minute, make the arrow go to the right a little bit, up, up, to the left a little bit, to the left. Okay, that round that area, to me it looks like once you get past the face of Jamaica, and then you look further and further into the country, then you see this configuration. It could be buildings, towers, it could be people, but I just got the sense of depth of identity going from a clear foreground into a less clear background, but the background is where the country is. Now, this observation was not quite as clear or succinct as my first one, but I just wanted to throw that out.
No, yeah, I think that's a great observation. I think it is, I would like to say that I had all of that in mind when making it, because again, that's a really beautiful observation. Unfortunately, I didn't have all of that in mind, but I will say that that is a really amazing observation that you made, because this piece, I actually started working with that specific piece of fabric and building in that background with a completely different composition in mind. And I did intend to create a background that was a little bit more out of focus, and from farther away, it was meant to be this landscape of all of the like mountain ranges you might see in Jamaica. But then I kind of left it for a while because it didn't feel right. And I came back to that piece and started building in all of that imagery in the foreground. So that's a really amazing thing that you were able to see via Zoom and not in person. So thank you again.
We've got one more question in the chat. Curious if the prints have titles, or will they eventually?
So I am not the biggest fan of naming my work. Some of my work does have titles, but for things like these prints, I will admit that they will probably be numbered, or maybe have subtitles. I think I know a few people don't really love subtitles, but I think they are kind of important for the act of just cataloging and archiving things. You know, once you start printmaking, you end up with more work than you really can expect. But yes, for now they're untitled. But I do typically, even if I'm leaving something untitled, I will kind of pick a defined object in there and let people know what that is. I think that can be really helpful for people.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us and share with us. Really quickly, one last question, and then I'll wrap things up. If people want to know more about you and your artwork, how can they do that?
Yes, so if people want to see more of my artwork or get in touch, I do have a website. It's Alanna-Reeves.com. Yes, I put it in the chat, but for anyone, in case you're writing it down, it's ALANNA-REEVES.com. My email address is there. If you want to get in touch over Instagram, my Instagram is linked there, and you can see a lot of previous work and hopefully some updates soon.
Great. Well, thank you again. Just a reminder to everyone, we're so excited to be having Alanna exhibit at Strathmore in the future. I'm going to go ahead and also link our webpage that lists that exhibition. This was previously scheduled for this year, but thankfully we were able to move it so that people can see it and enjoy it in person as we begin to open things back up. Strathmore will be reopening its doors for our new exhibitions in the fall with some new regulations. So please feel free to email info@strathmore.org if you're interested learning more about that. You can also check out our website, you know, all of the necessary precautions to make this a safe engagement for people, including some hours for high-risk visitors only, and some private appointments, appointment hours as well. But please do keep up to date on our website, sign up for our emails so you can see Alanna's work in person when she joins us for past process. Thank you again to everyone who's joined us, and thank you again, Alanna. It was such a pleasure to have you speak to your work, and looking forward to more.
Yeah, thank you again for having me. Thank you, Strathmore. Thank you, everyone who joined and asked questions. This was a lot of fun.
Great, wonderful. All right, well, everybody have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Bye.